The phone you bought came with apps you never asked for, never downloaded, and in many cases cannot delete. They were put there by the manufacturer, by your carrier, or by third-party companies who paid for placement on your device before it ever left the factory. They run in the background, they collect data, they consume battery and processing power. And most people who own these phones have never looked at what these apps are actually doing or what data they are sending back to the companies that put them there. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is documented fact confirmed by independent security researchers, consumer advocacy organizations, and in some cases by legal actions against the companies involved. The App Census Project, an independent research initiative that analyzes mobile apps for privacy behavior, has documented dozens of pre-installed apps on widely sold Android. Devices that transmit sensitive user data to advertising networks and data brokers without clear disclosure to users. The Electronic Frontier Foundation has published multiple investigations into carrier-installed apps that operate with permissions that go far beyond what their stated functions require. And researchers at security firms, including CryptoWire, published findings as far back as 2016, later confirmed and expanded by subsequent research, showing that firmware and pre-installed software on Android devices from certain manufacturers was transmitting personal data, including text messages and location information to remote servers. Understanding the scope of the problem requires understanding how phones are actually manufactured and sold. When you buy an Android phone, you are buying a device that has passed through multiple hands before reaching you. Google develops the Android operating system and provides a baseline. The device manufacturer, Samsung or Motorola or any other Android phone maker, adds its own software layer on top of Android, including its own pre-installed apps. If you bought the phone through a carrier like Verizon or AT&T, the carrier adds another layer of its own pre-installed apps on top of that. And in some cases, particularly on lower-cost Android devices, additional third-party apps are pre-installed by companies that have paid the manufacturer or carrier for that placement. By the time the phone reaches you, it may have dozens of pre-installed apps that you never chose, some of which have permissions and data collection behaviors that were negotiated between companies rather than presented to you for review. Apple's iPhone operates differently because Apple controls both the hardware and the software more tightly than any Android manufacturer. Apple pre-installs its own apps and does not allow carrier pre-installation of third-party apps in the same way that Android carriers do. However, Apple's own pre-installed apps collect data and have, on Android devices, the first step is finding out what is actually installed. Go to Settings, then Apps. On Samsung devices, this may be called Apps or Application Manager. Tap the three-dot menu or the filter option and select Show System Apps or All Apps. This reveals the complete list of everything installed on your device, including apps that do not appear in your app drawer and that you may never have seen. Work through this list and look for anything you do not recognize. Pay attention to apps from your carrier, apps with names that sound like analytics or advertising services, and apps that are duplicates of functionality already provided by Android or by apps you actively use. For each app you do not recognize, press and hold the app name to get to its detail page, or tap it to open the detail view. Check what permissions the app has been granted. If a simple utility app has been granted access to your contacts, your location, your microphone, or your call logs, that is a signal worth investigating. Search the app's name online along with terms like data collection or privacy concerns to find any reported issues with that specific app. For apps you cannot uninstall because they are protected as system apps, Android provides the option to disable them. Disabling an app does not remove it from the device, but it stops it from running, removes it from your app drawer, and prevents it from using a battery or data in the background. On the app detail page, look for the Disable button. If it is grayed out, the app is protected at a level that prevents disabling without rooting the device. If it is available, tap Disable to stop the app from running. You will typically be warned that disabling the app may affect other functionality. For most carrier-installed apps and third-party pre-installed apps, that warning is a formality rather than a genuine concern. Specific categories of pre-installed apps that deserve immediate attention on Android devices include carrier analytics apps. Every major U.S. carrier has at least one app pre-installed on devices sold through its network that collects usage data. AT&T's apps, Verizon's apps, and T-Mobile's apps have all faced scrutiny from privacy researchers. These apps typically have system-level permissions that cannot be easily removed. Disabling them stops their active operation even if it cannot fully remove them from the device. Manufacturer diagnostic and analytics apps are another category worth reviewing. Samsung, Motorola, LG, and other Android manufacturers pre-install apps that collect device diagnostic information. The stated purpose is improving product quality. The actual data collection can be significantly broader than that stated purpose would require. Look for apps with names that include terms like diagnostics, analytics, care, or device health in addition to the manufacturer's own branded apps. Third-party keyboard apps pre-installed on some lower-cost Android devices have been a particular area of concern. A keyboard app has access to everything you type, which means it has access to your passwords, your messages, your search queries, and everything else you enter on your phone. Research published by security firm Cryptowire in 2023 found keyboard apps pre-installed on certain Android devices transmitting typed content to remote servers. If you see a keyboard app pre-installed that you did not choose, replace it with a well-reviewed alternative from the Google Play Store and disable the pre-installed one. On iPhone, the approach to reviewing pre-installed apps is different because the apps themselves are Apple's own products, rather than third-party commercial arrangements. The privacy controls that matter most on iPhone are the permission settings for Apple's own apps and the data sharing settings within those apps. Go to Settings, then Privacy and Security, and work through each category, including location services, contacts, calendars, reminders, photos, microphone, and camera. For each category, you will see which Apple apps and which third-party apps have access. Review each one and revoke access for any app that does not need it for the function you actually use it for. Specifically on iPhone, several of Apple's own pre-installed apps have data collection behaviors worth understanding. Siri in dictation collects voice data that may be reviewed by Apple employees and contractors for quality improvement purposes. This can be limited in Settings, then Siri, then Talk to Siri, and by going to Settings, then Privacy and Security, then Analytics and Improvements, and turning off Improve Siri in dictation. The App Store collects purchase and browsing history within the store. Apple Maps collects location data, including trip information. These collections are disclosed in Apple's privacy documentation and are generally less concerning than the third-party data collection on Android devices, but users who want the most conservative possible data footprint should review these settings. For both Android and iPhone users, the most actionable ongoing practice is regular permission audits. Go to your privacy settings and look at which apps have access to location, microphone, camera, contacts, and other sensitive capabilities. For each permission category, review the list of apps that have access and revoke any that you do not actively need to have that access. On iPhone, this is in Settings, then Privacy and Security. On Android, this is in Settings, then Privacy, then Permission Manager. The research from App Census and the EFF consistently finds that the apps with the most concerning data collection behaviors are not necessarily the ones with the most recognizable names. Carrier apps, manufacturer utility apps, and pre-installed shopping and entertainment apps are where the most significant undisclosed data collection tends to occur. These are precisely the apps that most users ignore because they assume that anything pre-installed on the phone by the manufacturer or carrier must be trustworthy. That assumption is worth questioning. The manufacturers and carriers who pre-install these apps have commercial relationships with the companies whose apps they include. Those commercial relationships are not always aligned with your interests as a user. The data collected by pre-installed apps has value to the companies collecting it regardless of whether it has value to you. And the permissions granted to system-level apps are often broader than the permissions you would grant if asked directly. Find the apps on your device that you did not choose. Disable the ones you cannot delete. Revoke the permissions for the ones you cannot disable. And set a habit of reviewing your permission settings every few months to catch anything that has changed. Your phone came with apps you never asked for. You have the ability to stop most of them from running. The 30 minutes this takes is among the most direct privacy improvements available to any smartphone user right now. There's a specific class of pre-installed app that deserves extended attention because it represents the most significant privacy risk among everything discussed in this script, and because it is the least well understood by most smartphone users. It is the class of apps that operate below the level of the normal app ecosystem, embedded in the firmware or system partition of the device, rather than installed as a standard app. These apps cannot be removed through the normal app management interface, and in many cases cannot be disabled through the standard settings menu either. They are part of the operating system layer as the manufacturer or carrier shipped it. The Cryptowire research published in 2016 and expanded in subsequent years documented firmware-level software on Android devices from multiple manufacturers that was transmitting personal data without disclosure. The data transmitted in the cases they documented included text message content, call logs, location data, and device identifiers. The firmware software had been installed at the manufacturing level before the phones reached carriers or consumers and operated with permissions that went beyond what any normal app could be granted through the standard Android permission system. The response from the affected manufacturers varied. Some issued patches. Some disputed the findings. Some of the apps involved were removed from future device builds. But the category of concern, software operating at a level below normal app controls, has not disappeared. Subsequent research by different teams has identified similar behaviors on devices from different manufacturers at different price points. The problem is not specific to one company or one region. It is a structural feature of a device supply chain where data collection has commercial value, and where the technical mechanisms for embedding data collection below the user-visible app layer exist and are known to multiple actors in that supply chain. For most users, there is no practical way to audit firmware-level software without specialized technical knowledge and tools. What you can do is make informed decisions about which manufacturers you trust based on their track record on privacy, their transparency about pre-installed software, and their responsiveness when researchers have identified problems. Google's Pixel devices have a stronger track record here than many other Android manufacturers because Google controls the software stack more tightly and has commercial incentives aligned with demonstrating privacy credibility. Apple's iPhone has the strongest track record among mainstream consumer devices because Apple's control of both hardware and software is the most complete in the industry. A network monitoring app, or a VPN that logs the destinations of outbound traffic from your phone, can reveal whether apps or system software are communicating with servers that you do not recognize and cannot account for. Several free and paid options exist for this purpose. Setting one up and running it for a few days gives you a concrete picture of where your phone is sending data, which is the most direct evidence available to a non-technical user about whether pre-installed software is engaging in the kind of behavior that the research from AppCensus and CryptoWire has documented on other devices. The bottom line is that your phone is a commercial product that was assembled by companies with their own commercial interests, sold through intermediaries with their own commercial interests, and delivered to you with software configurations that reflect those commercial interests rather than yours. Understanding that is not a reason to abandon your smartphone. It is a reason to take 30 minutes to review what is running on it, disable what you did not choose and do not need, restrict the permissions of everything that remains, and stay informed about the apps and software that were put on your device before you ever turned it on. One final practical step that ties everything in this script together is creating a simple personal policy for new app installations going forward, because the problem of unwanted data collection does not only come from pre-installed apps. Every new app you install is a potential addition to the list of software on your device with access to your data. The permissions you grant at installation persist until you revoke them. The data practices of apps can change when ownership changes or when terms of service are updated. When installing any new app, make it a habit to install it first and then immediately go to the app's permission settings before using it to review and restrict what it has been granted. Many apps request the broadest possible permissions at installation and then function perfectly well with most of those permissions revoked. An app that requests access to your contacts, your location, your microphone, and your camera, when its core function is a simple game or a utility tool, does not need all of those permissions. Grant only what is clearly necessary. Revoke the rest. If the app stops working without a permission that you cannot justify granting, that itself is information about whether the app deserves to be on your device. Your phone belongs to you. The apps on it should be there because you chose them and because they serve your interests. The ones that were put there without your choice and that serve commercial interests other than yours deserve the same scrutiny you would apply to any software you installed deliberately. Find them today. Disable them. Restrict their permissions. And check back regularly to make sure nothing new has been quietly added without your knowledge. Do it today, right now.